The canyon had been silent for 3 days when they found her body, not the peaceful quiet of desert mornings, but the unnatural stillness that comes when even the buzzards refuse to fly overhead. When Sheriff Briggs rode down into Blood Moon Canyon with his deputy and the town doctor, they discovered why the Apache Queen's domain had gone silent. Someone had butchered Kiyah like an animal. The legendary Apache leader who had supposedly killed dozens of white men lay sprawled outside her own tent, her body bearing wounds that spoke of hatred so deep it had turned into something monstrous. But here's what made Sheriff Briggs's blood run cold as he examined the scene. Whoever had murdered the Apache Queen knew exactly how to make it look like a ritual killing. Too exactly. The positioning of the body, the specific mutilations, even the ceremonial objects scattered around the campsite. Everything was perfectly arranged to convince any investigator that this had been done by Apache warriors following ancient blood laws. Everything except for one small detail that the killer had missed. Apache don't use steel knives for ritual executions. They use obsidian blades blessed by tribal shamans. The wounds on Kiyah's body had been made by a military-issue cavalry saber, the kind carried by federal soldiers or territorial marshals, which meant someone with government training had murdered the Apache Queen and tried to frame her own people for the crime. But before Sheriff Briggs could process the implications of that discovery, something else happened that would turn his investigation into a nightmare. A stranger rode into the canyon, moving through the Apache camp like he owned the place, and when he dismounted near Kiyah's body, he looked down at the carnage with the calm assessment of a man who had seen this exact scene before, too many times before. The stranger was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of hard living on the frontier. His clothes were dusty from travel, but his gun belt was oiled and ready. When he knelt beside Kiyah's body and began examining the wounds with professional precision, Sheriff Briggs realized two things that made his mouth go dry. First, this man knew things about the murder that hadn't been shared with anyone outside the investigation. Second, he was studying the crime scene like a federal marshal who had been tracking this killer across multiple territories. "Sheriff," the stranger said without looking up, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "you might want to clear your men out of this canyon, because whoever killed Kiyah is still here, and they're not finished with their work." Before Briggs could ask how the hell this man knew the Apache Queen's real name, something that hadn't been public knowledge, the stranger was already moving toward Kiyah's tent with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. And when he emerged from that tent holding something that made Sheriff Briggs's world tilt sideways, the stranger's next words would expose a conspiracy that reached from Blood Moon Canyon all the way to the territorial capital. "Sheriff, I need you to arrest me for the murder of Kiyah, the Apache Queen. Because if you don't, the real killers are going to eliminate everyone in this canyon, including your men, and blame it all on a federal marshal who was supposed to be dead 3 months ago." The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a badge that gleamed silver in the desert sun. Deputy U.S. Marshal Jake Slade, presumed killed in the line of duty during a botched raid on a railroad corruption ring that had been selling Apache sacred lands to foreign mining companies. But here's what Sheriff Briggs couldn't have known, what no one in that canyon realized until it was almost too late. Jake Slade hadn't come to Blood Moon Canyon to investigate Kiyah's murder. He'd come to prevent his own. Sheriff Briggs stared at the federal badge in Jake Slade's weathered hands, his mind racing through implications that grew more dangerous by the second. A deputy U.S. Marshal who was supposed to be dead, examining a crime scene like he'd been expecting to find it, knowing details about the Apache Queen that weren't public knowledge. "Marshal Slade," Briggs said carefully, his own hand moving closer to his weapon, "you want to explain how a dead man happens to know so much about a fresh murder?" Jake's smile was grim as winter frost. "Because I've been tracking the same killer across 4 territories for the past 6 months. Kiyah makes number 7, and if we don't stop him soon, she won't be the last." "Him?" Railroad executive named Harrison Colt, then systematically murdering Apache leaders who refused to sign over their sacred lands to his mining consortium, makes it look like tribal warfare, covers up his tracks, then swoops in to buy the territory from grieving families at rock-bottom prices. Dr. Peterson, who had been examining Kiyah's body with growing unease, looked up sharply. "Marshal, these wounds, they're identical to ones I saw on a Navajo chief up in Colorado Territory last spring. Same positioning, same mutilation patterns." "That would be victim number 4, Jake confirmed. "Harrison Colt's getting sloppy though. He's using the same signature every time, thinking no one's going to connect murders across different territories." Sheriff Briggs felt pieces of a horrific puzzle clicking into place. "You're saying this railroad man has been staging fake Apache murders to steal tribal lands?" "I'm saying Harrison Colt has been committing genocide for profit, and he's been getting away with it because no one expected the murders to be connected." Jake moved toward his horse, pulling out a leather saddlebag that clinked with the sound of metal on metal. "But there's something else, Sheriff. Something that makes this particular murder different from all the others." He opened the saddlebag and dumped its contents on the ground near Kiyah's body. What Sheriff Briggs saw made his blood turn to ice water. 7 scalps, each one bearing the distinctive silver hair ornaments worn by Apache leaders. 7 identical cavalry sabers, their blades still stained with dried blood. And most damning of all, 7 pieces of correspondence bearing the letterhead of the Colorado and Western Railroad Company, each one signed by Harrison Colt and detailing payment schedules for territorial acquisition services. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Williams whispered. "He kept trophies." "Professional habit," Jake replied grimly. "Railroad executives document everything, even murder. Problem is, Harrison Colt isn't just killing Apache leaders anymore. He started eliminating anyone who might be able to connect him to the murders. Anyone like federal marshals investigating railroad corruption. Anyone like federal marshals who got too close to the truth about his operation." Jake's expression grew darker. 3 months ago I was closing in on evidence that could have brought down Colt's entire conspiracy. Then someone tipped him off, and my safe house got hit by professional killers." Sheriff Briggs studied Jake's face, seeing the kind of haunted look that came from surviving something that should have been fatal. "But you escaped." "I escaped because Kiyah saved my life." Jake knelt beside the Apache Queen's body, his voice dropping to something approaching reverence. "She'd been tracking the same killer I was, gathering evidence of the murders. When Colt's men came for me, she got me out of that safe house and hid me in Apache territory while I recovered." "So you've been working together." "We've been planning to expose Colt's operation to federal authorities." Kiyah had evidence that could have proven he'd been murdering tribal leaders across the Southwest. Documents, witnesses, financial records showing payments from the railroad to territorial officials. Dr. Peterson stood up, dusting off his hands with movements that suggested he'd seen enough death for one day. "Marshal, where is that evidence now?" Jake's smile was sharp as a blade. "Hidden somewhere in this canyon where Harrison Colt will never find it." "But there's a problem, Sheriff. A big one." Before anyone could ask what kind of problem, the sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Not the careful hoofbeats of Apache ponies, but the heavy thunder of shod mounts ridden by men in a hurry. "That would be Harrison Colt and his private army," Jake said, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Right on schedule." Sheriff Briggs counted at least 8 riders descending into the canyon, all heavily armed and moving with military precision. At their head rode a man in expensive Eastern clothing whose soft hands and pale complexion marked him as someone who spent more time in boardrooms than on horseback. "Gentlemen," Harrison Colt called out as his men spread into a threatening formation around the crime scene. "I trust you've finished examining this unfortunate tragedy. Terrible business, these Apache tribal wars." "Mr. Colt," Sheriff Briggs replied carefully. "Funny thing about timing. You seem to have arrived awfully fast for someone who just heard about a murder." Colt's smile was cold as mountain snow. Bad news travels fast in the territories, Sheriff. When I heard that poor Kiyah had been killed by her own people, I felt obligated to come pay my respects. Her own people. Jake stepped into view, his marshal's badge catching the afternoon sunlight. That's interesting, considering the murder weapon was a cavalry saber, not an Apache ritual blade. Harrison Colt's composure cracked for just a moment, but it was enough for everyone present to see the recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly who Jake Slade was, and he'd been expecting to find him here. "Marshal Slade," Colt said smoothly, "I heard you were dead. Killed in some unfortunate business up north, wasn't it?" "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Jake replied, "but I'm betting you already knew that, considering you're the one who ordered the hit on my safe house." Colt's men were shifting positions now, hands moving closer to weapons while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. Sheriff Briggs realized they were all about to be caught in the middle of a gunfight between federal law enforcement and private corporate killers. "Sheriff," Jake said quietly, never taking his eyes off Colt, "you might want to get your men to cover. This is about to get ugly." But before anyone could move, Dr. Peterson made a discovery that changed everything. "Marshal," he called from where he'd been continuing his examination of Kiyah's body, "you need to see this." He held up something that made everyone in the canyon freeze. A small piece of paper, folded and hidden beneath Kiyah's body, covered with symbols that looked like a mixture of Apache pictographs and surveyor's marks. "What is it?" Sheriff Briggs asked. Jake's eyes widened as he recognized what the doctor had found. "It's a map." Kiyah managed to hide a map showing the location of every piece of evidence we'd gathered about Harrison Colt's operation. Harrison Colt's face went white as he realized what that meant. If federal authorities got their hands on that map, they'd be able to recover enough evidence to hang him for multiple murders and fraud on a scale that could bankrupt his entire railroad consortium. "Kill them all," Colt ordered his men. "Make it look like they died fighting Apache raiders." The gunfight that erupted in Blood Moon Canyon would be talked about for years afterward. Sheriff Briggs and his deputy, fighting alongside a supposedly dead federal marshal and an elderly doctor, against 8 professional killers led by a railroad executive who had been committing genocide for profit. But what none of them knew, what wouldn't be discovered until the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, was that Kiyah, the legendary Apache Queen, had planned for this moment. She'd known Harrison Colt would come to the canyon looking for the evidence she'd gathered. She'd known he would bring enough men to eliminate any witnesses, and she'd known that her death would be the bait that finally brought her killer out into the open where federal justice could reach him. What she hadn't counted on was surviving long enough to see it happen. The battle was fierce but brief. Harrison Colt's men were professional killers, but they were fighting on Apache territory against opponents who knew every rock and shadow in the canyon. When the gun smoke finally cleared, Colt lay dead beside his hired guns, and Jake Slade stood over the bodies with the kind of satisfied expression that came from finally settling a long overdue debt. "Is it over?" Sheriff Briggs asked, reloading his rifle with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. "Not quite," came a voice from the canyon wall above them. Everyone looked up to see a figure emerging from a hidden cave, moving with fluid grace despite obvious injuries. Kiyah, the Apache Queen, was alive, bloodied, wounded, but unmistakably alive. "Jesus Christ," Dr. Peterson breathed. "How is that possible?" Kiyah descended carefully, one hand pressed against a bandaged wound in her side. Harrison Colt made the same mistake most white men make when dealing with Apache. He assumed we couldn't think ahead. Jake stared at her in amazement. "You faked your own death." "I used my sister's body," Kiyah replied with matter-of-fact grimness. "Naili volunteered, knowing it was the only way to draw Colt into the open. She died of fever 3 days ago, and we arranged her body to look like Colt's previous murders." The terrible weight of sacrifice settled over the canyon like a shroud. Sheriff Briggs realized he was looking at a woman who had used her own sister's corpse as bait to catch a serial killer. "The evidence?" Jake asked. Kiyah smiled for the first time since appearing. "Safe. Hidden where only Apache can find it, but marked on a map that federal authorities will be able to read." She gestured toward the paper Dr. Peterson still held. "Everything you need to prove Harrison Colt was murdering tribal leaders and selling their lands to foreign mining companies, and the other railroad executives who were part of his conspiracy. Their names are in the evidence cache, along with financial records and correspondence proving the entire operation reached back to corporate boardrooms in New York and Chicago." Jake felt relief flooding through him for the first time in months. "It's over then. We got them all." But Kiyah's expression grew serious again. "Not all, Marshal. Harrison Colt was just the territorial representative. The real conspiracy involves federal officials in Washington who've been authorizing the land sales and covering up the murders." "How high does it go?" "High enough that a federal marshal was marked for death when he got too close to the truth." Kiyah looked directly at Jake. "High enough that they'll try again once word gets out that you're still alive." Sheriff Briggs was studying the bodies scattered around the canyon, counting the cost of Harrison Colt's greed. "Marshal, what happens now?" Jake looked at the evidence in Dr. Peterson's hands, then at Kiyah, then at the canyon walls that had hidden so many secrets for so long. "Now we make sure Nayeli's sacrifice wasn't in vain. We take this evidence to federal authorities who can be trusted, and we bring down every person involved in this conspiracy. And if there aren't any federal authorities who can be trusted," Jake's smile was sharp as justice itself, "then we take it to the newspapers. Let the American people decide what they think about railroad companies that commit genocide for profit." As they prepared to leave Blood Moon Canyon with evidence that would rewrite the history of territorial expansion in the Southwest, Kiyah made one final revelation that would change everything Jake thought he understood about his own survival. "Marshal," she said quietly, "there's something else you need to know. The reason I was able to save you from Harrison Colt's assassins 3 months ago." "What's that?" Kiyah's smile was mysterious as desert moonlight. "I've been working for the federal government longer than you have. Undercover agent, assigned to investigate the systematic murder of tribal leaders." Jake stared at her in shock. "You're federal. I'm Apache first, federal second. But when my own people started dying, I volunteered to work with anyone who could help me stop the killing. So when you saved my life, I was saving my partner." Kiyah's expression grew soft with something that might have been affection. "The government paired us up 6 months ago. We just didn't know it until Harrison Colt tried to kill us both." As they rode out of Blood Moon Canyon with evidence that would destroy a corporate conspiracy spanning multiple states, Jake reflected on how a simple murder investigation had become something much more important. Sometimes justice requires sacrifice, sometimes it requires deception, and sometimes it requires two people from different worlds working together to expose truths that powerful people would kill to keep buried. 6 months later, Jake stood in a federal courthouse in Denver, watching the last of Harrison Colt's co-conspirators being led away in chains. The trials had exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of the railroad industry, and resulted in the prosecution of dozens of corporate executives and federal officials. Kiyah had been offered a permanent position with the newly formed Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, working to prevent future cases of systematic murder disguised as territorial disputes. The Apache Nation had been granted expanded legal protections and compensation for lands illegally sold to mining companies. But it was the newspaper headlines that Jake found most satisfying. "Railroad genocide exposed. Apache Queen helps bring down corporate killers. Federal justice prevails in territorial murder conspiracy." The truth had a way of surviving even when powerful people tried to bury it. As Jake prepared to return to Arizona Territory as head of a new federal task force investigating crimes against Native Americans, he reflected on how a supposed death had led to real justice. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is fake their own murder. But sometimes it's the only way to expose killers who think they're above the law. The legends would change now. They'd speak of the Apache Queen who chose justice over revenge, the federal marshal who refused to stay dead, and the alliance between two different worlds that proved truth was stronger than bullets. And they'd all begin the same way. The canyon had been silent for 3 days when they found her body. But some silences hide secrets worth dying for, and some deaths are too important to be real. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where justice and deception collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.